All his facts that he was taught was wrong. In Acts 9:3 and 4 it says, and as he journeyed, he came near Damascus. And suddenly there shined around about him a light from heaven. And he fell to earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecuteth me? You see, all of us have been in that same fix that Paul was in. We were lost, hopeless, headed for a Christless grave with no hope for eternity with God. 4.5 billion people on this planet today is in the same boat. But through the power of his resurrection, God lifted him up, lifted me up, lifted you up, giving us new lives inside and out. And we want that power, or we should. We want to know the power such as the world doesn't even begin to understand that kind of power. Power to overcome our problems and difficulties. I want that. I hope you do too. Second, sharing in the fellowship of his sufferings. Oh. Paul didn't stop there. He went on to say, I want to know Christ and fellowship in the sharing of his suffering. Now, wait a minute, Paul. You're getting a little crazy here, telling me I'm going to share in sufferings. That may be going a little too far. Sharing his resurrection is great, and I love that power. But to share in sufferings, wait a minute, that may be going too far. Or is it? There's a veteran of World War II proudly proclaimed he was a member of the survivors. There's a club from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Not many of them left anymore. But he was one of them. He spoke, and you could tell he and his brothers had suffered together. And because they had suffered together, they had a unique fellowship that existed among them. Short story, I was called when I served in the United States Army. I was 17 years old, and the Egypt and Israel war broke out. Now, I thought at 17 I was a man. I thought I'd grown up and I was hanging out with men. I was treated like a man. I thought I was a man. Well, when that war broke out, they called us in, and I was in personnel. So you were not safe. But I served. And they gave us our weapons and our backpacks and our rounds. Our weapons were fully loaded. We were sitting around waiting for a plane, about 20 of us. And we were waiting to go, and they said, we're going to Israel. And I didn't even know where Israel was. And it was a very scary moment in my life because of that. They even said, make your last calls. If anybody loves you, you may want to call them because you're going to war. So I had somebody love me, I thought. So I called them and said, I won't be home for dinner, apparently. And then we all gathered together and we sat in this one little room waiting for the truck to take us to the plane. And after about 20 minutes, all of a sudden this feeling of camaraderie, brotherness came together. We just all sat around and looked at each other, and we knew we was going to war. Now for me, I had just come from high school. It was like sitting around the locker room before a game and getting prepared to go into that war. But this was slightly different. We were getting ready to go to the real war. We were getting ready to fight. But right then, common brotherly identified with us, and as we was preparing to go to this war, we all kind of looked at each other without a word spoken, knowing, you may die tonight. I may die tonight. And at first it was a little nervous. Then we kind of absorbed it, and it became a oneness in this group. And though we knew we might die, we started getting excited. And then people started saying, you know what? I'm coming off that plane in a bad mood. And all of a sudden it was like, let's do this. No matter who comes back, we live together and we die together. That was an amazing time of suffering together with this group of people. Alcoholics go through that. Those that have overcome alcoholism can understand it better than others because they've suffered the same pains as other people. People who come through divorce can help other people who are going through divorce. They felt those same hurts and pains. They know what it's like. People who've lost children can help other people who are coming through that same experience because they've done that. They've experienced those hurts. And there's that common bond of suffering. So there's a fellowship in suffering, isn't there? I'll tell you right now, I'll never trade that moment. And it was just a moment, but it was like it happened last night with those men when we was getting ready to do that. I'd never trade that special moment in my life. Look at Paul's life. He had been shipwrecked and beaten and stoned, thrown in prison. Finally, he was beheaded. All for Christ. Yes, he suffered. When he looked at the scars on his body, he said the scars inflicted by the whips and the stones, the lashing, he called them marks for Christ. He said, I bear on my body the marks of Christ. Now, we don't have to suffer that most of the time in this world. When we say, will you suffer for Christ, just know it happens in a lot of different ways. Jesus suffered when they brought sinners to him. He looked over the city of Jerusalem and he cried. He cried because he knows this city had been offered forgiveness. The city had been offered the way that was right, the way of God. They turned their backs on God. They turned their backs on Jesus, and he knew it, and he wept. He knew their destination. Sin causes our hearts to be broken. We suffer with Jesus when we look at a world that is caught up in sin and selfishness. We should weep over it too. When we do, we share in the sufferings of Christ, don't we? Lastly, we need to share in the death of Christ. Finally, Paul says this, I want to know Christ by becoming like him in his death, somehow to attain the resurrection from the dead. Now I'm thinking, suffering may be one thing, but that's going pretty far now, isn't it? Most of us don't want to die. Most of us want to live. But I guess most of us do, or if you think about it in another way, do we really? Maybe we do want to share in the death of Christ. All of us are moving towards that moment in time when we will finally lay down this body and take up our new existence with Christ. Everybody in this room is guaranteed that experience. Paul literally died for him by being beheaded for the cause of Christ. If history is right, all the other apostles did too, except John. They gave their lives for Christ, and in a sense, we do too. We live our lives as a living sacrifice to Jesus. Or should we? There's something special and precious right there, isn't there? About being able to say, I have lived out my moment on earth for Christ. I think we should. I have given him my time and my energy and my talent. I'm willing to become like him even in death. There's this old preacher. He was 75 and lived in Ohio. He had built a strong church, but he was getting ready to pass the baton to a younger preacher. He spent most of his life preaching to the congregation of his little church. All he wanted to know was, did he have to quit ministering to them because he's retiring? Did he have to stop calling on them? A lot of friendships made over those years. Did he have to stop praying with them? He didn't want to interfere with the new preacher. He's got a new job to do. But he wondered if he had to stop serving Christ. When they looked into his eyes, they saw the marks of Jesus. The marks of kindness, understanding, sympathy, that had been etched in his face and in his eyes over decades of serving Jesus. Decades of faithful preaching. Decades of marrying young people, burying his friends and family, church family also. Decades of counseling, praying, serving, and ministering. It was all there in his eyes. Now, he wasn't beheaded, but you could see the marks in his eyes. His watch was a Timex. His suit was made from J.C. Penney's. I got one of those, don't I, Miss B? He drove an old small car. You won't see his name in the paper, but he left everything to follow Christ. That is the greatest epitaph that one can ever hope to have on their tombstone, I think. And I ask you, do you think your tombstone will reflect that type of life? In a time of materialism, in a time of corruption, there seems to me that there's not a better passage in the Bible that has more to say to the church than the one we're studying today. You see, we don't offer an invitation that just promises the power of resurrection. The invitation also includes the sufferings, the fellowship in the sufferings, and the promise of death. You may not want an invitation like that, but it's important for you to understand that the invitation always includes that, whether you wanted it or not, whether you understood it or not. That is the only way we're ever going to know Christ, gain Christ, and ever get to truly know him.